Welcome back, everyone. Today we will be reading chapter 16, so let's get into it. During everything that followed, all the time while he nearly got creamed by a vaporetto as he swam to shore, while he dragged himself up some ancient stone steps out of the water, the Grand Canal was well appointed with means of egress for those who fell or flung themselves into it, and trudged back to Josh's Palazzo alone. Josh, having had his hands full keeping Poppy out of the clutches of the carabinieri, who showed up shortly after Quentin went under. Quentin's mind was on fire with the only piece of useful information the dragon had given him, that there was still a way back to Fillory. They weren't going to get the button, but he could let go of that now, because there was a way back. If they could just figure out what the dragon meant. He thought about it while he rinsed off salt and oil and heavy metal particles and, worse, in a half-hour shower, at high temperature and high pressure, and washed his hair 3 times and dried off and finally tossed his ruined clothes. His beloved Fillorian clothes, his royal clothes, into the trash and crawled into bed. The first door, the dragon had said. The first door. The first door. What did it mean? Of course, there were other words in there to think about. There was a lot to take away from that brief conversation. The old gods were returning. Something about being a hero, all definitely important, of paramount importance. But the first door, that was the action item. He had the scent. He was going to do it. He was going to follow the clues and get them out of here and back where they belonged. He was going to be a hero, damn it all. Whatever the dragon said. He would lose whatever he had to lose, if that's what it took to win. Poppy woke him up the next morning at 7. It was like Christmas morning for her. She was just so excited, and she'd waited as long as she could. She wasn't even jealous. She'd already had 3 cappuccinos, and she'd brought him one. Australians. He thought she was going to start bouncing on his head. They all worked through the possibilities together over breakfast. The first door, Josh said. So it's some primal-like door? Like Stonehenge? Stonehenge is a calendar, Poppy said. It's not a door. In the course of general orientation, Poppy had almost incidentally been brought up to speed on the existence of Fillory. Irritatingly, she took it in stride, the way she did everything else. She was interested in it from an intellectual point of view. She assimilated the information, but it didn't set her imagination burning the way it had Quentin's. Maybe it's like a time lock, like on a vault. Dude, Quentin said, forget Stonehenge. It must be something in Venice, like a sea gate or something. Venice is a port. That's a kind of door, a portal. A whole city is a door. Yeah, but the first? Or it's a metaphorical door, Poppy said. The Bible or something, like in Dan Brown. You know, I bet it's something about the pyramids, Josh said. It means the Chatwin's house, Julia said. The conversation stopped. What do you mean? Poppy said. Their aunt's house in Cornwall, where they discovered Fillory. That was the first door. It was nice to see Poppy beaten to the punch for once. But how do you know? Poppy asked. I know, Julia said. Quentin hoped that she wouldn't say what she was about to say next, but she said it anyway. I can feel it. What do you mean, feel it? Poppy said. Why do you care? Julia said. Because I'm curious. Quentin intervened. Julia seemed to have taken an instinctive prickly dislike to Poppy. It makes sense. What's the first way people got into Fillory? Through the Chatwin's house. The clock in the back hall. I don't know, Josh said. He rubbed his round, stubbly chin. I thought you could never get in the same way twice. And anyway, Martin Chatwin was a little kid. That's fine for him, but no way I could fit through the door of a grandfather clock. Not even you could. All right, Quentin said. Sure, but... Plus, it was supposed to be a personal invitation specific to the Chatwins, Josh went on. Like, those particular kids were particularly awesome in some way, so Ember summoned them so they could use their awesome personal qualities to fix shit in Fillory. We have awesome personal qualities, Quentin said. I think we should go. It's our best lead. I am going, Julia said. Road trip, Josh said, turning on a dime. All right. It felt good to be making decisions anyway, whatever they were based on. It felt good to get moving again. We'll go tomorrow morning, unless anybody has a better idea before then. It was getting increasingly hard to not notice that Poppy was helpless with laughter. I'm sorry, she said. I really am. It's just that, I know it's real, or I guess it's real, but you do realize that this is a kid's thing. Fillory? It's like you're worried about how to get to Candyland, or, I don't know, Smurftown. Julia got up and left. She didn't even bother to get annoyed. She took Fillory seriously, and she had no patience for, and no interest in, anyone who didn't. He hadn't noticed till now, but Julia could be pretty unpleasant when she wanted to be. You think Candyland is real? Josh said. 'Cause I would ditch Fillory in a red-hot minute for that shit. Chocolate swamp and all. And, have you seen Princess Frostine? Maybe it's not real to you, Quentin said a little stiffly. It's just that it's very real to us, or to me anyway. It's where I live. It's my home. I know. I'm sorry. I really am. Poppy wiped her eyes. I'm sorry. Maybe you just have to see it. Maybe you do. But Quentin thought he probably never will. The next day, they all went to Cornwall. That's where the Chatwins' house was. The house where in 1917, the Chatwin children went to stay with their Aunt Maud, and met Christopher Plover, and found their way into Fillory, and the whole magnificent, wretched story began. It was incredible that the house still existed and had been sitting there at all this time, and that you could just go there. But in a way, it was incredible that he hadn't been there already. The Chatwin house wasn't open to the public, but its general whereabouts weren't a secret. It was a matter of historical / Wikipedian record. Nobody had torn it down. It's not like somebody was going to stop them, other than possibly the current owners and the local constabulary. It was about time he went there, if only to pay his respects at what was basically the Trinity test site of the Florian mythos. As far as getting there went, Josh swore up and down that he'd been doing serious work with opening portals lately, and he was pretty sure he could get one through to Cornwall. Quentin asked Josh where he thought Cornwall was, then immediately rephrased and said he would give Josh $100 if he could tell him whether Cornwall was in England, Ireland, or Scotland. Smelling a trick question, Josh went non-linear and guessed Canada. But when Quentin actually showed Josh where it was on the map, away down at the southwestern tip of England, Josh redoubled his swearing. That shit's practically next door. It's in Europe. And went into a very technically sophisticated disquisition on lines of magnetic force and astral folding. It really was time Quentin got out of the habit of underestimating him. Poppy said she wanted to come too. I've never been to Cornwall, she said. I've always wanted to meet a native speaker. Of English? Josh said. 'Cause, I can probably introduce you. Of Cornish, jackass. It's a Brythonic language, meaning it's indigenous to Britain, like Welsh and Brenton, and Pictish, before everything was polluted by the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans. There's tons of power in those old languages. Cornish died out a couple hundred years ago, but there's a big revival happening now. Where are we going exactly? They were still sitting around the breakfast table, which over the course of the morning had become the lunch table. Espresso cups and wobbly towers of plates and silverware had been transferred to the floor to make room for a massive atlas Josh retrieved from the library, along with the Fillory books and a biography of Christopher Plover. It's called Fowey, Quentin said. It's on the south coast. Poppy said. She put a fingertip on the map. We could come in through Penzance. It's a couple of hours' drive from there, tops. Penzance? Or Penzance? Josh said. Like, as in the pirate stuff? Like in the Pirates of... Since when is that a real place? See, okay, I want to say something about this, Poppy said. She pushed the atlas away and sat back in her chair. If I could have the floor for just a moment. Yes, Penzance is a real place. It's a town. It's in Cornwall, and it's real, as in it exists on Earth. You're also obsessed with other worlds. You're so convinced that this one is crap and everywhere else is great, but you've never bothered to figure out what's going on here. I mean, forget Penzance. Tintagel is real. Is that... Didn't King Arthur live there? Quentin said weakly. King Arthur lived in Camelot, but he was conceived at Tintagel, supposedly. It's a castle in Cornwall. Fuck it, Josh said. Poppy's right. Let's go there. It was amazing. Quentin had never met a magician like Poppy. How could someone so utterly literal-minded, so resolutely uninterested in anything beyond mundane reality, work magic? Yes, but you see, he said, the fact is, King Arthur probably wasn't conceived at Tintagel, because he probably didn't exist, or if he did exist, he was probably some depressing Pictish warlord who was always killing people and breaking them on the wheel and wrapping their windows. He probably died of the plague at 32. See, that's my problem with this world, if you really want to know. I'm pretty sure that when you say that King Arthur was real, you don't mean King Arthur like in the books. You don't actually mean the good King Arthur. Whereas in Fillory, and feel free to find this hilarious, Poppy, but it's true, there are actual real kings who aren't bullshit, and I'm one of them. Plus, there are unicorns and pegasi and elves and dwarves and all that. He could have added that some very bad things were real in Fillory that weren't real here, but that wouldn't have strengthened his argument. There are not elves, Julia said. Whatever, that's not the point. The point is, I could pretend I don't have a choice and just live here my whole life. I could even go live in Tintagel, but I do have a choice, and I only have one life, and if it's all right with you, I'm going to spend it in Fillory, in my castle, chilling with dwarves and sleeping on Pegasus feathers. Because it's easier, Poppy said. And why not do the easiest possible thing? Because isn't that always the best thing? Yes, why not? Why not? Quentin had absolutely no idea why Poppy aggrieved him so much, and so efficiently, with such great precision, and he didn't know why he sounded so much like Benedict right now either. All right already, Josh said. Stop. You live here, you live in Fillory, everybody's happy. Sure, Poppy chirped. God, Quentin thought. It's just Janet all over again. They assembled 2 hours later in the narrow street behind the palazzo. The building was too heavily warded to cast a portal inside it. I thought maybe we could do it down there. Josh peered doubtfully down the street. There's one of those tiny Venetian micro alleys down there. Nobody ever uses it. Nobody else had a better suggestion. Quentin felt shifty. It was like they were looking for a place to shoot up or have sex outside. Josh led them 20 yards down the street, which itself wasn't much more than an alley, then cut left into a gap between buildings. There was barely room for two people to walk next to each other. At the end of the alley was a bright ribbon of water and sunlight, the Grand Canal. It was deserted, but Josh hadn't been completely right about nobody ever using the alley, because somebody had definitely used it as a urinal not too long ago. It reminded Quentin of when he used to catch a portal back to Breakbills at the end of summer. Usually they'd send him down some random local alley and put the portal at the end. The thought of it ignited a hot coal of nostalgia in his chest, for a time when he didn't know better. Let me just see how much of this I remember. Josh pulled a crumpled piece of paper out of his pocket, on which he'd scribbled neat columns of coordinates and vectors. Poppy, who was taller than him, kibitzed over his shoulder. See, it's not direct, he said, but there's a junction you can use. It's out in the English Channel somewhere. Why don't you go through Belfast? Poppy said. Everybody does. Then you double back south. It's actually shorter in astral geometry. Nah, Josh squinted at his writing. This is way more elegant, you see. I'm just saying, if you miss the junction and we go in the water, it's a long swim to Guernsey. Josh stuffed the paper in his back pocket and squared off into his spellcasting stance. He spoke the words quietly and clearly, without hurrying, with a lot more confidence than Quentin ever remembered him having. He made a series of symmetrical movements with his arms, shifting his fingers rapidly through different positions. Then he squared his shoulders, bent his knees, and hooked his fingers firmly underhand into the air, like he was preparing to haul open an especially heavy garage door. Sparks flew. Poppy yipped in surprise and stepped back in a hurry. Josh straightened his back and heaved upward. Reality cracked, and the crack slowly widened, revealing behind it something else. Green grass and brighter, whiter sunlight. When the portal was halfway open, Josh stopped and shook out his hands, which smoked. He outlined the top of the doorway with his fingers, then the sides. One side wasn't quite straight, and he accidentally snipped off some of the alleyway wall. Then he got under it again and pulled and pushed it open the rest of the way. Quentin kept glancing at the mouth of the alley while all this was going on. He heard voices, but nobody walked by. Josh stopped to check his work. Now, in the middle of the bright Venetian afternoon, there stood a rectangle of cooler, somehow higher definition, English noon. Josh bunched his sleeve in his fist and rubbed off a last smudge of Venice. "All right," he said. "Pretty good?" His pants were scored with pinhole burns from the sparks. Everyone had to admit it looked pretty good. They stepped through one by one, gingerly. The bottom of the doorway wasn't quite flush with the pavement, and you could shear off toes on the edge if you weren't careful. But the connection was right, with no sensation as you went through. It was a totally other level of workmanship. Quentin thought with satisfaction from the crude portals they'd gone through between the safe houses. They had skipped Penzance after all, as well as Belfast. Josh brought them out in a public park not far from the center of Fowey. This kind of precision over that much distance hadn't been possible even a few years ago, but Google Street View was an absolute boon to the art and craft of creating long-distance portals. Josh went through last and scrubbed it out behind him. Quentin didn't think he'd ever seen anywhere as quintessentially English-looking as Fowey, or maybe he meant Cornish-looking. He wasn't sure what the difference was. Poppy would know. Either way, it was a small town at the mouth of a river that was also called Fowey, and Beatrix Potter could have drawn it. The air was cool and fresh after the summer fug of Venice. The streets were narrow and winding and shin-splittingly steep. The sheer volume of floral window boxes overhead almost blocked out the sun. At the little office of tourism in the center of town, they learned that the various Foweys were all pronounced Foy, and that even aside from Christopher Plover, the town was something of a hotbed of fictional settings. Manderley, from Rebecca, was supposed to be nearby, as was Toad Hall from The Wind in the Willows. Plover's house was a few miles out of town. The National Trust owned it now. It was enormous, and some days it was open to tourists. The Chatwin's house was privately owned and not on any tourist maps, but it couldn't be far away. According to legend and all the biographies, it abutted Plover's property directly. They sat on a bench in the thin English sunlight, like clarified butter, while Poppy went off to rent a car. She was the only one of them who carried the full complement of valid IDs and credit cards. When Julia pointed out that she could have stolen one just as easily, Poppy looked at her with wordless horror. She returned in a peppy silver Jag. Who would have thought you could even get one out here in Smurftown? She said. They knocked back a pub lunch and set out. It was Quentin's first time in England, and he was amazed. Once they got up the coastal slope and out of town, out into the lumpy, uneven pastures dotted with sheep and stitched together with dense dark hedges, it looked like more like Fillory than he'd thought anywhere on earth could. Even more than Venice. Why hadn't anybody told him? Except, of course, they had, and he hadn't believed them. Poppy in the driver's seat, grinning at him via the rearview mirror as if to say, "See?" Maybe she was right. He hadn't given this world enough credit. Zipping along the narrow highways and shady lanes of rural Cornwall, the four of them could have been regular people, civilians, and would they have been any less happy? Even without magic, they had the grass and that blessed country solitude, and the sun flickering past between the branches, and the solace of an expensive car that somebody else was paying for. What kind of an asshole wouldn't be satisfied with that? For the first time in his life, Quentin seriously considered the idea that he could be happy without Fillory. Not just resigned, but happy. They were certainly as close to Fillory as you could get on Earth. They were closing in on the Chatwin's house. Even the place names sounded Fillorian. Tywardreath, Castle Door, Lost Withel. It was as if the green landscape of Fillory was hidden right behind this one, and this was a thin place, where the other world showed through. Cornwall was certainly having a good effect on Julia. She was almost lively. She was the only one of them with the gift of not getting carsick while she read. So, as they drove, she paged through the Fillory books, applying stickies to certain passages, reading others out loud. She was compiling a list of all the different ways the children had gotten through, a practical traveler's guide to leaving this world behind. In The World in the Walls, Martin gets in through the grandfather clock, and so does Fiona. In the second one, Rupert gets in from his school, so that does not help us. And I believe Helen does too, but I cannot find it. In The Flying Forest, they get in by climbing a tree. That might be our best bet. We wouldn't have to break into the house, Quentin said, and we could all fit. Exactly. And in the secret sea, they ride a magic bicycle, so let us keep an eye out for that. Maybe there is a garage or a shed with old things in it. You realize the fans have probably picked this place clean like years ago, Josh said. We can't be the first people to think of this. Then, in the Wandering Dune, Helen and Jane are painting in a meadow somewhere nearby, which seems like a long shot, but if we have to, we can go back to Foy for art supplies, and that is it. It's not quite it. Sorry. But nobody one-upped Quentin on Fillory trivia, not even Julia. Martin gets back in the Flying Forest at the end, though Plover doesn't say how he did it, and there's a book you're missing, The Magicians, which is Jane's book about how she went back to Fillory to find Martin. She used the magic buttons to get in, which she found in the well, where Helen threw a whole box of them. Jane only used one to get back, so there may be more lying around. Julia turned around in her seat. How do you know that? I met her, Jane Chatwin. It was in Fillory. I was getting better from my injuries after we fought Martin, after Alice died. There was silence in the car, broken by the ticking of the turn signal as Poppy took a fork in the road. Julia studied him with those empty, unreadable eyes. Sometimes I forget everything you have been through, she said finally, and turned around to face forward. It only took them 45 minutes to find Plover's house, a.k.a. Dara's house, which must have once been in the deep countryside, but now you could get there on a well-maintained 2-lane road. Poppy pulled over on the other side. There was no shoulder, and the Jag tilted at a perilous angle. All 4 of them got out and straggled across the road. There was no traffic. It was about 3:30 in the afternoon. The grounds were surrounded by a formidable stone wall, and the gate framed with an almost fussy architectural perfection. A view of a palatial Gregorian country house set back deep in carefully tended grounds. Dara's house was one of those rectangular English houses made of gray stone that probably conformed to some nut-job 18th century theory about symmetry and ideal proportions and perfect ratios. Quentin knew Plover had been rich. He'd made one fortune in America already, selling dry goods, whatever they were, before he came to Cornwall and wrote the Fillory novels. But the scale of it was still stunning. It wasn't so much a house as a cliff with windows in it. Jeez, Josh said. Yeah, said Poppy. Hard to imagine somebody living there all by themselves, Quentin said. He probably had servants. Was he gay? Dude, totally, Josh said. There was a sign on the gate. Dara's house, Plover Farm, with a schedule of hours and tours and entrance fees. A blue plaque gave them a capsule biography of Plover. It was a Thursday, and the house was open. A large black bird retched loudly in the underbrush. So are we going in? Poppy asked. He'd thought they would, on the off chance that they might stumble on something, and so they could say they had. But now that they'd arrived, the place felt empty. Nothing here called to Quentin. Plover had never gone to Fillory. All he'd done was write books. The magic was somewhere else. Nah, he said. I don't think so. Nobody disagreed. They could come back tomorrow if they were still on Earth. They trooped back across the road and spread out the map on the hood of the car, the exact location of the house the Chatwins had stayed at near Fowie. E, was a matter of speculation, but not wild speculation. There was a limited number of places it could be. The Plovers books were full of enchanting descriptions of how the Chatwin kids, singly and en masse, ran and skipped and cycled over from their Aunt Maud's house to visit their beloved Uncle Christopher. Plover had been famously had a little child-sized gate built in the wall that separated their properties to let them through. They had 2 Plover biographies with them. One soft focus hagiography from the 1950s, authorized by the family. The other, a hard-nosed psychoanalytic expose from the early 1990s that anatomized Plover's complex and problematic sexuality, as symbolically dramatized in the various Fillory novels. They stuck to that one. It had better geography. They knew that the Chatwin house was on 1 Darrowby Lane, which helped, although the Cornish were even less interested in signage than the Venetians. Fortunately, Poppy turned out to be excellent at this kind of cross-country dead-reckoning navigation. At first, they thought she must be using some kind of advanced geographical magic until Josh noticed that she had an iPhone in her lap. "Yeah, but I used magic to jailbreak it," she said. It was late afternoon, and they'd traversed what seemed like several hundred verdant and Watership Down-esque but stubbornly unmarked and unidentifiable rural byways. And the light was turning bluish before they settled on a target property, which sat on a narrow lane that wasn't definitely not called Darrowby, and as near as they could tell, pretty much had to back into Plover's enormous estate. There was no wall or gate, just a gravel track curving back through the late summer trees. A square stone post next to it supported a no trespassing sign. They couldn't see the house from here. Quietly, Julia read out the relevant passage from The World in the Walls. The house was very grand, 3 stories tall, with a facade made of brick and stone, and enormous windows, and endless numbers of fireplaces and window seats and curving back stairs and other advantages, which their London house distinctly lacked. Among those advantages were the sprawling grounds around the house, which included long straight alleys and white gravel paths and dark green pools of grass. There was a time when Quentin could probably have said it along with her from memory. Quentin sat in the car and stared across the road. He couldn't see much evidence of anything as nice as that. The place didn't exactly scream portal to another world, either. He tried to imagine the Chatwins arriving here for the first time, the 5 of them crammed into the back seat of some sputtering black proto-automobile, more carriage than car, and with a fair amount of locomotive DNA in it as well, their luggage tied to the boot with twine and Victorian leather strappage. They would have been funerally silent, resigned to exile from London. The youngest 5-year-old, Jane, the future watcherwoman, reclining on her old sister's lap as on a chaise longue, lost in a fog of longing for her parents, who were respectively fighting World War I and raving in a posh rest home. Martin, who would grow up to become a monster who would kill Alice, keeping his composure for the sake of the youngsters, his soft boy's jaw set in grim, pre-adolescent determination. They'd been so young and innocent and hopeful, and they'd found something more wonderful than they could ever have hoped for, and it had destroyed them. "What do you think?" he said. "Julia, this is the place." "All right. I'm going to go in. Look around." "I'll come," Poppy said. "No," Quentin said. "I want to go alone." To his surprise, it worked. She stayed put. Becoming invisible was a simple idea in theory, but in practice it was a lot harder than you'd think. It had been done, but it took years of meticulous self-erasure. And once accomplished, it was practically impossible to undo. Apart from anything else, you could never be sure you'd reinstated your visible self completely accurately. You came out looking like a portrait of yourself. The best workaround, Quentin knew, was more like an animal's protective coloring. If you were standing in front of some leaves, you looked drab and leafy. If you weren't moving or jumping around, an observer's eye tended to skate over you, usually, if the light wasn't too good. The car door chunked shut in the stillness. He felt the other's eyes on his back as he crossed the road. There was something on top of the stone post. Buttons. They were scattered in the grass around it, too. Big ones, small ones, pearly ones, turquoise shells. It must be a fan ritual. You come by, you leave a button, the way people left joints on Jim Morrison's grave. Still, he stopped and touched each of them, one by one, just to make sure none of them were genuine. The camouflage spell was unbelievably crude. He picked up a big leathery oak leaf, snapped off a shingle of bark from a tree, plucked a blade of the scanty grass, and collected a granite pebble from the edge of the road. He whispered a rhyming chant in French over them, spat on them, and, the glamorous life of the modern sorcerer, stuffed them in his pocket. Farther up and farther in, he stayed off the gravel driveway and picked his way through the trees for 5 minutes, until there were no more. And then he was looking at Aunt Maud Chatwin's house. It was like he was looking back through time. The unpromising driveway had been a hustle. It really was a grand house. It probably would have qualified as magnificent if they hadn't just come from Plover's house. As Quentin got closer, the gravel track pulled itself together and became a proper driveway, which clove in two and formed a circle with a modest but still entirely effective fountain at the center. 3 rows of tall windows adorned the front, and the gray slate roof was a beautiful profusion of chimneys and gables. Quentin hadn't known what to expect. A ruin, maybe? Or some appalling new modernist facade. But the Chatwin house was perfectly appointed and restored, and the lawns looked like they'd been trimmed that morning. It was everything Quentin had hoped for, except for one thing. It wasn't empty. That well-maintained lawn was littered with cars. They were nice cars that made the rental jag look pokey by comparison. Yellow lights spilled out of the lower floors and out into the mellowing dusk, chased by some nicely judged, not over-amplified early Rolling Stones. Whoever's private hands the house was in, they were having a party. Quentin stood there on the outside looking in as a little convocation of evening gnats began to gather over his head. It seemed sacrilegious. He wanted to barge in and order everybody out like Jesus ridding the temple of moneylenders. This was ground zero for the primal fantasy of the 20th century, the place where Earth and Fillory had first kissed like 2 cosmic billiard balls. But the chatter, a roar went up. Over the chatter, a roar went up, and a woman shrieked and then laughed uncontrollably. But looking on the bright side, it was a tactful windfall. It was a big enough party that they could mingle in, the girls especially. They wouldn't sneak in at all. They would walk in the front door, brazen it out. Then, when any suspicions had been allayed, they would slip upstairs and see what they could see. He walked back to the car to get the others. They found a spot for the car on the lawn. They weren't the least plausible bunch of partygoers imaginable. Quentin had invested in some nice clothes in Venice, charged to Josh's bottomless credit card. If anybody asks, just say John brought you. Good one, dude. Are you gonna... Josh gestured to Quentin's appearance. Oh, right. Probably better not to show up looking like a pile of mulch. He killed the camouflage spell. Crossing the threshold, Quentin closed his eyes for just a moment. He thought of little Jane Chatwin still alive and at large somewhere. Maybe she would be at the party too. Josh made straight for the bar. Dude, Quentin hissed. Stay on mission. We're in deep cover. I'm getting into character. For all that, it was a party at Maud Chatwin's house. It was also just a party like any other party. There were pretty people and unpretty people, drunk people and undrunk people. People who didn't care what anybody thought about them, and people standing in corners afraid to open their mouths lest somebody look directly at them. Deep cover notwithstanding, Josh revealed himself to be conspicuously American by asking the bartender for beer. He wound up settling for a Pimm's cup, which he consumed with an air of disappointed bafflement. But he and Poppy made themselves agreeable to the other guests with an ease and skill that Quentin found awe-inspiring. Genuinely social people never ceased to amaze him. Their brains seemed to generate an inexhaustible fund of things to say, naturally, with no effort, out of nothing at all. It was a trick Quentin had never figured out. As an unattached American male among English strangers, he felt inherently suspicious. He did his best to affiliate himself with small groups and nod along politely in response to people who weren't especially talking to him. Julia found a wall to put her slender back against and looked dangerously mysterious. Decorously mysterious. Only one man dared to approach her, a tall Cantabrigian type with a half-grown beard, and she sent him packing in terms of uncertain he had to salve his wounds with cucumber sandwich. After a half-hour of this, Quentin felt he could begin a slow drift towards the stairs. Not the grand terrace-style ones in front, but a more unassuming, utilitarian staircase toward the back of the house. One by one, he caught the other's eyes in turn and inclined his head. We were just looking for a bathroom, all four of us. Too bad they didn't have drugs. That would have made a better cover story. The staircase performed a tight switchback up to the second floor, a hushed and darkened maze of white walls and parquet. The rumble and tinkle of the party was still clearly audible, but hushed now, like distant surf. There were a few kids up here, helling along the hallways and racketing in and out of rooms, laughing a little too hysterically, playing some game nobody knew the rules of, flopping down on the coats when they got tired. The kind of forced pack of one-shot friends that exists on the margins of all grown-up parties. The World in the Walls wasn't a how-to manual, and it was irritatingly vague as to the precise location of the famous clock. One of the back corridors of one of the upper floors was all the detail Plover gave them. Maybe it would have been better to split up, except that would have violated the basic teaching of every movie ever made. Quentin would have worried that everybody else would slip through into Fillory without him, leaving him behind in reality like the last man standing in a game of sardines. Whoever lived here now didn't use the top floor at all, and it had gone unrestored. Another piece of luck. They hadn't even refinished the floors. The varnish had worn off them. and the walls were old wallpaper, with even older wallpaper showing through in places. The ceilings were low. The rooms were full of mismatched and broken furniture under sheets. The quieter it got, the realer Fillory began to feel. It loomed in the shadows, under beds, behind the wallpaper, in the corner of his eye, just out of view. 10 minutes from now, they could be back on the Muntjac. This was the place. This was where the children played, where Martin vanished, where Jane watched, where the whole terrible fantasy began. And there in the hallway, the back hallway, as it had been written, as the prophecy foretold, stood a grandfather clock. It was a beast of a clock, with a big fat brass face orbited by 4 smaller dials, tracking the months and the phases of the moon and the signs of the zodiac and God knew what else, all framed in plain, uncarved dark wood. The works must have been hellishly complex, the 18th century equivalent of a supercomputer. The wood was the wood of a Florian sunset tree, it said in the book, which shed its flaming orange leaves every day at sundown, endured a leafless winter overnight, and then sprouted fresh green ones at dawn. Quentin, Julia, Josh, and Poppy gathered around it. It was like they were reenacting a Fillory book. No, they were in one, a new one, and they were writing it together. The pendulum wasn't moving. Quentin wondered if the connection could still be live, or whether it had broken after the children went through. He couldn't feel anything, but it had to work. He would make it work. He was going back to Fillory if he had to cram himself into every fucking piece of cabinetry in this house. Even so, it was going to be a tight fit. Maybe if he breathed out all his air and wriggled through sideways. Not how he planned to make his triumphant return to Fillory, but at this point, he'd take whatever worked. Quentin, Josh said. Yeah? Quentin, look at me. He had to tear his eyes away from the clock. When he did, he found Josh watching him with a gravity that didn't suit him. It was a new Josh gravity. You know I'm not going, right? He did know. He'd just let himself forget in all the excitement. Things were different now. They weren't kids. Josh was part of a different story. Yeah, Quentin said. I guess I do know. Thanks for coming this far. What about you, Poppy? Chance of a lifetime. Thank you for asking me. She seemed to mean it, to take it in the spirit in which it was offered. She put a hand on her chest. But I've got my whole life here. I can't go to Fillory. Quentin looked at Julia, who'd taken off her shades in indifference to the gloom of the top floor. Just you and me, kid. Together they stepped forward. Quentin got down on one knee. The roar of their imminent escape thundered in his ears. As soon as he got up close, he could see that it wasn't going to work. The thing wasn't ticking, but more than that, it just looked too solid. The clock was what it was, and nothing more. It was brute, mundane matter, wood and metal. He turned the little knob and opened the glass case, and looked in at the hanging pendulum and chimes and whatnot other brass hardware dangling there impotently. His heart had already gone out of it. It was dark in here. He reached in and rapped the back of the case with his knuckles. Nothing. He closed his eyes. God damn it, he said. Never mind. It wasn't over. They could always try climbing trees, though at that moment he felt less like climbing a tree than he'd ever felt like doing anything in his entire life. You're doing it wrong, you know. Their heads turned in unison. It was a little kid's voice, a boy. He was standing at the end of the corridor in his pajamas, watching them. He might have been 8 years old. What am I doing wrong? Quentin said. You have to set it going. You have to set it going first, the boy said. It says in the book, but it doesn't work anymore. I tried. The boy had fine, tousled brown hair and blue eyes. A more quintessential English moppet it would have been hard to find. Right down to his having a spot of trouble pronouncing his I's and R's. He could have been cloned from Christopher Robin's toenail clippings. Mummy says she's going to send it to the shop, but she never does. I climbed the trees, too, and I did a painting. Lots of them, actually. You want to see? He stared at him. Not finding himself rebuffed, he walked over on bare feet. He had that dismal air of sprightly self-possession that some English children have. Just looking at him, you knew you were going to have to play a game with him. I even had Mummy pull me round in an old wagon we found in the garage. He said it, garage. It's not the same as a bicycle, but I had to try it. I can see that, Quentin said. I can see where you would have to do that. But we can keep looking, though, he said. I like it. My name's Thomas. He actually held out his little paw for Quentin to shake, like a tiny alien ambassador. Poor kid. It wasn't his fault. He must be so chronically neglected by his parents that he had taken to press-gagging random party guests into paying attention to him. He made Quentin think of faraway Eleanor, the little girl on the outer island. The really awful thing was that Quentin was going to go along with it, and not for the right reasons. He took the proffered paw. It wasn't that he felt bad for Thomas, though he did. It was that Thomas was a valuable ally. Adults never got into Fillory by themselves, at least not without a magic button. It was always the kids. What Quentin needed, he realized, was a native guide to act as bait. Maybe if he let young Thomas here course along ahead of him, like a hound across the moors, he just might flush out a portal or two. He was going to use Thomas to chum the waters. Just get me a drink, Quentin said to Josh as Thomas pulled him away, as they passed Poppy. Quentin firmly grabbed her hand. The misery train was leaving the station, and Quentin wasn't going to travel alone. It emerged, with remarkably little prompting from Quentin or Poppy, that Thomas's parents had bought the Chatwin house a couple of years ago from the children of Fiona Chatwin. Thomas and his parents were themselves, through some connection that Quentin couldn't follow, distantly related to Plover. Maybe that was where the money came from. Thomas had been simply mad with excitement when he heard the news. Weren't all his friends at school jealous? Of course now he had all new friends, because before he'd been in London, and now they were in Cornwall. But his friends here were much nicer, and he only missed London when he thought about the Rainforest Life exhibit at the zoo. Had Quentin never been to the zoo in London? If he could choose, would he be an Asian lion or a Sumatran tiger? And did he know that there was a monkey called a red teddy monkey? It wasn't rude. You could say it because it was a real kind of monkey. And didn't he agree that, under certain extreme circumstances, the murder of children was completely ethically justifiable? Towed by Thomas, the tank engine, they toured the grounds. As a threesome. They conducted a deep cavity search of the top floor, including closets and attics. They made 7 or 8 circuits of the enormous green behind the house, with special attention paid to rodent burrows and spooky trees and copses large enough for a human being to infiltrate. Meanwhile, Josh kept up an underground railroad of gin and tonics, handing them off to Quentin whenever he happened to pass by, like a spectator handing Gatorade to a marathoner. It could have been worse. The view from the back terrace was even grander than the front. An orderly English estate had been hacked out of the rough Cornish countryside by main force, including a flat, still swimming pool that, by some landscaper's artifice, had mostly escaped looking anachronistic. Beyond it, a perfect constable vista rolled down and away. Green hills and fallow hay fields and pocket villages, all slowly dissolving in the viscous light of a golden English sunset. Thomas enjoyed the attention, and Poppy, he'd give her this, was a heroically good sport. She had no real stake in how all this turned out, but she pitched right in. She was nothing if not game. Moreover, she was better at it than he was, hardened as she was by many tours in the babysitting trenches. It all finished up, predictably, in Thomas's bedroom. By 10:30, even Thomas, with his titanically fresh-faced lust for life, couldn't be coaxed into one more round to find Fillory. They all sat or sprawled on the rainbow-colored woolly yarn rug in Thomas's room. It was a huge room, a little kingdom all Thomas's own. It even had an extra bed in it in the shape of a space rocket, as if to cruelly emphasize Thomas's other childhood, the hilarious sleepovers he wasn't having. Josh and Julia joined them there. The party raged on beneath them into the night, having degenerated from a cocktail party into a regular party. They should leave, obviously. At this point, Thomas had gone from harasser to harassed. Maybe Josh was right. Maybe they'd try Stonehenge next. But not before they'd burned this bridge right down to its charred pilings. So they played other games. They ground out rounds of Animal Snap and Rummy and Connect 4. They played board games, Cluedo, and Monopoly, and Mousetrap, until Thomas was too tired and they were too drunk to follow the rules. They dug deeper into Thomas's toy closet, and thus further back into Thomas's childhood. For games so mathematically simple, they were barely games at all, lacking, as they did, almost any strategic element. War and snakes, and war and snakes and ladders, and hi-ho Cheerio, and finally high seas. A primarily simple alphabet game in which the main goal seemed to be to win the pre-game argument with your fellow players over who got to be the dolphin. After that, everything else was blind chance and cartoon fish. Quentin took a slug of flat, warm gin and tonic. It tasted like defeat. This was how the dream died. In a welter of plastic, primarily colored board game pieces upstairs at a bad party. They would keep looking. They would knock on all the first doors they could think of. But for the first time, lying there sprawled on the spare bed, his long legs flat out, with his back against Thomas's rocket ship headboard, Quentin took seriously the possibility that he wasn't going back after all. Probably hundreds of years had gone by in Fillory anyway. The ruins of Whitespire were dissolving in the rain, white stones softening like sugar cubes under green moss by a now nameless bay. The tombs of King Eliot and Queen Janet were probably long since overgrown with ivy, twin clock trees rising from their twin plots. Perhaps he was resembled as a legend, King Quentin the Missing, the once and future king like King Arthur. Except, unlike Arthur, he wasn't coming back from Avalon, just the once king. Well, it was a fitting place to end it, the Chatwin's house, where everything started. The first door. The really funny thing was that even though he'd hit bottom, he couldn't honestly say that it was all that bad there. He had his friends, or some of them. They had Josh's money. They still had magic and alcohol and sex and food. They had everything. He thought of Venice and the pure green Cornish landscape they'd just driven through. There was so much more to this world than he thought. What the hell did he have to complain about? Fuck all was the answer. One day he'd have a house like this too, and a kid like Thomas, who lay fast asleep with the lights on and his arms thrown up over his head, a marathon runner breaking the tape in his dreams. He and some lovely and talented Miss Quentin, who, Poppy? Surely not, would get married, and Fillory would fade away like the dream it so fundamentally was. So what if he wasn't a king? It had been lovely for a while, but here was real life, and he would make the most of it like everybody does. What kind of a hero was he, if he couldn't do that? Julia kicked his foot. By unspoken agreement, they were all grimly determined to finish the game of high seas, and it was his turn. He flicked the spinner and moved forward 2 waves. Josh, who was playing as the whale, had a commanding lead, but Julia, the squid, was making a late charge, leaving Poppy, Fish, and Quentin, Jellyfish, to battle it out for a distant 3rd place. Josh spun. He was on a charade square. "Caw!" Josh said. "Caw-caw!" "Seagull," they all said in unison. It was like when they were geese. Josh spun again. Julia belched. Quentin slumped over behind Poppy's warm back, onto the infinitely soft and sweet-smelling pillows. From this point of view, it was apparent that Poppy was wearing a thong. The bed was not entirely stable. The drinks were catching up with him. It wasn't clear whether the spins were going to spin themselves out or gather speed and power and wreak terrible vengeance upon him for his many transgressions. Well, time would undoubtedly tell. "Caw!" Josh said. "Enough already," Quentin said. "Caw, caw! Seagull! I said seagull!" The light hurt his eyes. It was uncomfortably bright in Thomas's room. That was enough drinking for tonight. Quentin sat up. "I know, man," Josh said. "I heard you." "Caw!" The cawing didn't stop, nor did the spinning. The bed was definitely in motion, not so much spinning as rocking gently. They all froze. Poppy reacted first. "No way." She lunged off the bed and landed in water. "God damn it, no fucking way." The sun was hot overhead. A curious albatross was circling over them, making respectful inquiries. Quentin jumped up on the bed. "Oh my God, we did it! We did it!" They had broken through. It wasn't the end. It was all about to start all over again. He spread his arms wide to the daylight and let the hot sun slam straight down into his face. He was a man reborn. Julia was looking around her and sobbing as though her heart would break. They were back. The dream was real again. They were adrift on the high seas of Fillory. That's it for today. We'll see you guys next week with Chapter 17.